Good morning. Good morning. It is Zena Krogadal. I am so excited that you have joined me today on American Dreammakers. We have an amazing guest today, and I cannot wait to introduce her. I just want to play the intro video, and then we'll get her on. Here we go. Hello, hello, hello. I am back, and it is a wonderful Thursday morning, and I have wonderful Kimberly Stevens in the house. She is a phenomenal woman. She has a phenomenal story to tell. She is highly successful, and her successes came with a lot of trials and storms, and so cannot wait to have her come tell you the story. Here we go. Kimberly, how are you today?
I'm doing great. It's a wonderful Thursday, right before Mother's Day.
Right before Mother's Day. Yes. Happy Mother's Day.
To you and everyone listening.
Yes, absolutely. And for those of you that are joining us live today, please go ahead and comment and let us know you're here. And then also share this out. Kimberly has an amazing message. So we want to make sure that it gets out to the world to hear and experience. And so, Kimberly, without further ado, tell us about yourself. Tell us your story. Tell us everything.
That's tall order. As you've already stated, I am Kimberly Stevens, and my most recent and proud accomplishment is that I published a book called Altered: Finding Hope Through Grit and Gratitude to Never Give Up. And that is a segue into never giving up no matter what you do. And that can be in sports. I was a competitive swimmer. That can be as a parent. I am a parent who raised a very special needs child, also lost a child, and it can be in our business as well. I happen to have gone through major failure financially, and now through insurance sales have rebuilt my life. So never giving up is really who I am, and my story revolves around that message.
Oh, yes. So why don't you, I guess, maybe take us back to the beginning of that story? I know you had definitely some wonderful things that you didn't know was going to be such a big part of your story.
Absolutely. So given that it's Mother's Day, I am going to start with my children. That is probably the most near and dear part of my story. And so that goes back to 1991. And I was working on staff with Cru, or Campus Crusade for Christ, and was due to deliver my first child on Christmas Day. He was born on December 23rd, Braden Michael Thomas. He was perfect. We took him home. He gained a couple ounces by the time he saw the doctor at his first doctor visit. And then at about 6 or 7 days old, he just wasn't acting right. And his breathing started getting worse. And the long story short is we rushed him into the hospital, and he was put on life support, and we were told that if he lived 24 hours, he would likely be okay. Well, 24 hours came and went, and he wasn't okay, and nothing had changed. And we just didn't know what to do, and truthfully, neither did the hospital or the doctors. And 3 or 4 days later, in walked a doctor, Dr. William Nyan, and he basically said, "We know what's wrong with your son. He has citrullinemia." I'd never heard of that. Most people have never heard of that. Citrullinemia is a urea cycle disorder that affects about 4 children in the world a year. Urea cycle disorders affect a lot more kids in the world per year. So we were a small part of a family of disorders. This disorder is such that the children are born without the ability to process protein. So what happened is when my milk came in, it was actually the protein in my milk that poisoned him, put him in a coma. And by the time we knew what to look for and how to treat it, we were fighting a battle that we couldn't win. And eventually, at 15 days old, Braden died from organ failure from the medications. And it, to say that it's heartbreaking is, yeah. And even though it's 31 years ago, there isn't a day that goes by that I don't think about him. Obviously, over time, that grief has changed, but it was a very significant loss and moment in my life that has continued. So we had a 1 in 4 chance that we would have a child born with citrullinemia every time we conceived, because Braden's dad and I both carried a recessive gene. So just like blue eyes, I don't have blue eyes, but I can give the gene for blue eyes. And that's how it was with citrullinemia. So it took me a very long time, close to 9 months of anger, sadness, grief, asking the question why, and feeling very angry that the answer just never came. And I will never forget this day. It was in August of 1992. And I was basically not able to even notice that the sun was shining in San Diego. And I decided that I was going to go into a chapel and I was going to settle with God. And I thought I was going to walk in there and scream and yell and shake my fist and demand the answer. Why? And what ended up happening was very different. I did start out by asking the question, why? This is not fair, all of the usual things. And what came back to me was, there's no answer good enough that will take away my pain. And I just had this sense that if God sat down with a cup of coffee next to me, or a shot of tequila, or whatever your beverage of choice is, right? If God sat down with that and he just audibly said to me, Kimberly, this is why, it wouldn't have taken away my pain. And it was in that moment that I realized asking why was the wrong question. And asking how to get through it with God's help was the right question. And up until that point, God had done so many amazing things for me. And one of them was just revisited today. So I have to bring this up. So this is a yellow rose that I clipped from my garden this morning. And shortly after my son passed away, I planted a yellow rose bush in my yard in San Diego. And I thought I was taking care of it appropriately, but I planted it in a spot where it wasn't getting enough sun. And so it never produced flowers. And I would water it and feed it and take care of it and watch it. But it never had any buds on it until early May of 1992. But we know what happens in May. It's Mother's Day. And Mother's Day, after you've lost your first and only child, is a very, very painful day. And I was dreading that day from the moment my son passed away. And here was my yellow rose bush that I planted in memory of my son with a bud on it. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, I hope it blooms on Mother's Day. And sure enough, the very first rose from that rose bush appeared on Mother's Day that year. And it was God acknowledging and telling me I was a mother, I was loved, and that he was taking care of my boy in heaven. And that rose meant so much to me. But then the miracle of that rose bush kept going and still keeps going in my life. The second rose bloomed the night before Father's Day. I clipped it, put it in the refrigerator, and gave it to Braden's dad on Father's Day that year. And together, we looked at that rose and we wept over God's goodness. And then fast forward 2 years, and I was pregnant with my daughter, Victoria. And we had done prenatal diagnosis and we were told that she was healthy. And so it was late November and there was a bud on that rose bush. And I just knew she wasn't going to be born until that rose bloomed. And so here I was, my belly out to, the wall, and just wishing I could have her sooner. So I thought about taking a hairdryer outside and making the bud bloom faster so I could have her sooner. And I didn't. I let it be. And she was born and she came home and the rose didn't bloom. And I remember being really surprised by that. And 3 days later, we were home, and I remembered that they had done backup testing while she was in the hospital after she was born, and I hadn't heard any results. And I didn't think that she was sick, but they tortured her getting the specimens, so I wanted the results. And so I called the lab and asked where the results were, and they hummed and hawed and found them in the back, found her specimens actually in the back of a freezer. And they said they would run them right away. And about 4 hours later, we got a phone call. And they said, you need to get your daughter into the ICU immediately. So she was 3 days old, and we took her back to the ICU. Now, I went into the pumping room, and it was time for her to nurse, and she could not nurse from me until we knew if we had a confirmation on the diagnosis or not. And so they were simply drawing an ammonia level, which is the chemical that builds up in their system if they are getting sick and not processing their protein. And so I was in the pumping room, and as I had done for my son, I saved the milk, and I walked out, and the news was back, and they said, your daughter has citrullinemia. anemia. And I just started bawling. And the doctor said she probably wouldn't live a week. And I turned around and I went back into the pumping room, and I grabbed my milk out of the refrigerator and I dumped it down the drain. And every other dream that I had had for her. And I walked back out. And by the time I got back out, Janie, our pastor's wife, was there. And it was the first time she was meeting Tori, my daughter. And I just looked at Janie and I said, she's going to die. We just got the diagnosis. And she turned around and she grabbed me by the shoulders. And she looked me square in the eye and she said, this is not Braden. This is Victoria Faith. You will fight for her. And I decided in that moment, I decided that she was going to kindergarten healthy. And I began organizing my life around that dream and that goal. And Tori was in the hospital for 8 more days and was discharged and was able to go home. She was on specialized medication, specialized formula that was made with my breast milk and other formulas combined. The day we got home from the hospital, this bloomed. And I knew it was a sign from God that everything would be all right. Over time, every Mother's Day, God has given me a yellow rose in one way or another, whether my kids send them to me or when I moved to Florida several years ago, my neighbors had a yellow rose bush outside the front door, and it would always bloom on Mother's Day. And it's just almost becoming hilarious that I always get roses from God, yellow roses from God on Mother's Day. So when this one came this morning, I was not only ecstatic, but I also noticed there's a couple more buds, and I'm very sure that there will be another one on Mother's Day.
Wow. What a beautiful story. I'm so glad you shared that, and how special that is that you get to have roses from the Lord each Mother's Day.
It's amazing. And, you know, I stopped my story short with the rose, but the actual victory and just amazing part about my daughter's story is that we went through 4 years of struggle, basically to keep her alive. And every day was a struggle. 6 hours without her medication would have put her in a coma. She was in many comas. She was in life flight helicopters. She was in the ICU for weeks at a time. And it was a very tough battle for 4 years. But just before her 4th birthday, she received a liver transplant. And she received her liver from a 4-year-old child, which also made my heart ping, and still does, to know that someone's 4-year-old died so mine could live. But my daughter went into her transplant. She didn't speak a word. She had been stalled in her development at about 18 months old. And we were pouring into her. And she came out of the transplant, literally woke up from the anesthesia, speaking in full sentences. Wow. It was the first time that I started to know and understand things that she liked. Once all of the chemical craziness was cleared out of her system, I got to know her. And she was even more wonderful than before. And the bottom line, she went to kindergarten, healed and healthy. She took her kindergarten teacher on the very first day a bouquet of yellow roses from my garden. I know that the teacher had no idea about the significance of that, but it was very, very significant to me. And then my daughter ended up in special ed. We took about 3 years to catch her up to be able to be mainstreamed into the regular class. So by 3rd grade, she was in a regular 3rd grade class. And then she worked very, very hard on all of her skills. And it was high school freshman year that she really caught up to grade level. And she graduated from high school as the first and only child ever born with citrullinemia to graduate high school. And wow. We had a giant party where we had people from her 2-year-old days and her 5-year-old days and just everybody who we could find who would come back and celebrate. And so that was just a giant celebration of her victory and God's faithfulness. She's now married, 29, and lives in Kansas City. And she has had her graft or her new liver now for over 25 years, which is also a miracle that is nearly unheard of in the transplant community. So many reasons to say God is good, and I am grateful every minute of every day for her life and where we've come from.
And you named her very appropriately, Victoria, victorious, Victoria Faith.
Yeah, her name means conqueror through faith.
I'm sure that was no accident. That probably was placed in your heart from the very beginning for a reason.
Amen. Yes, ma'am.
So tell us, I mean, that's hard for any mother to have had to have gone through losing a child, the first child, and then the second child having the same diagnosis. And was it, because it's a genetic thing, was that likely that each child you had was going to have?
Each child had a 25% chance of inheriting the disease. I do need to absolutely share that I have a third child. His name is Daniel. He's Daniel because he went through the lion's den, and he does not have and was not born with central anemia.
Wow.
And he lives in Scottsdale, and he is my second miracle. So that I have so much to celebrate on Mother's Day.
You sure do. That you absolutely do. And tell us, and I know there's many moms out there who have had loss of a child. Tell us, how were you able to have the strength to get through what you had to get through?
That is such a hard question to answer succinctly. And I'll say that some days I didn't. And some days, by God's grace, I did. The moment when it all changed for me was that day in the chapel at the altar and laying down my questions and my anger. And as I did that, God began to change my heart. And I have a very good friend also in Kansas City who is struggling with some very hard things right now. Not the loss of a child, but actually some very hard things financially. And he was numbing his pain with drugs and alcohol. And he and I spent a lot of time on the phone on the Saturday before Easter. And he just said, I need help. I can't do this. And he was very angry about a lot of the circumstances in his life. And I asked him if he was willing to do what I did, to go to the altar, to the chapel, and just duke it out with God. And he said no. And I said, okay, are you willing to be willing tomorrow? And he responded yes. And I was actually able to see him last week. And he is now going on 4 weeks sober. And he said, that question saved my life. And that question has saved my life numerous times. And the first person who asked that question of me was a woman named Lynn, who was my angel after Braden died. And she called me every day. She walked with me every day. She would ask me, are you willing to talk to God today? No. Okay. Are you willing to be willing tomorrow? And I would always say, maybe. And I think that's the question. If we're not willing today, are we willing to be willing tomorrow? Because as soon as we can spin it to, yeah, I'm willing to be willing, then we open the door for God to work.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I really appreciate you sharing that, and how beautiful it is that God had placed some women, some people in your life that were of such encouragement. I love that you talked about, even with Victoria, that your pastor's wife just kind of, basically said, "Get it together." She's doing
Absolutely.
it. So how important is it, that we surround ourselves with people who are encouraging? What would you say?
Oh my gosh, it's 100%. And our natural response to pain is to isolate, numb, deny, forget it, right? I don't want to deal with it. I want to run away. And that's the exact opposite of what we need to do to get through. And probably the most important thing is to have somebody that we can just be honest with. Are you willing? No, I'm not. And, Lynn took no offense to me saying that. And, I wrote about our conversations in my book. And what struck me as I was writing it is I was angry at a God she loved. And yet she still didn't take offense at my anger and my feelings. She just listened and then asked that next question: are you willing to be willing tomorrow? And it's just brilliant.
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. And I think too, a lot of us think that having anger and disappointment in God is a wrong emotion. And I love that she lets you be in it, because it's being angry isn't the sin. It isn't a sin. It's an emotion, and we experience it. Even Jesus experienced it. It's what we choose to do with it, that determines, the I guess the next things on the list. Whether it is sin or it isn't. What a wonderful friend that she allowed you to be in that moment, instead of shaming you or making you feel terrible for feeling that way.
Or trying to fix me, or trying to tell me that it wasn't as bad. And, there were people who did that too. And that is one thing that I think I've taken from my own story is when people don't know what to say, sometimes they just say the wrong thing.
Mhm.
And it's not that they are being insensitive, it's that they truly don't know what to say. So they say something to fill the space and the discomfort. But sometimes those words are really hurtful. And separating the person from the words that they may say in their discomfort is very, very important. Very hard to do in that moment. I can testify to that all day. And it's really in hindsight that I've been able to look back on some of the most hurtful comments and understand that people were just trying to help, and that was their best effort.
I love that you share that too, because it is hard to remember that in that moment, to show grace to those who don't know and don't understand, and to just understand that they're humans as well. So sometimes we don't always say the right things. But I also love that, you're expressing, how we do need to think a little bit more when somebody is having a hard time, a really difficult time, and that we may not understand. I may not understand. And so I need to be a little more sensitive and refraining. So it's better to say nothing at all than to probably open your mouth and start quoting scriptures. And, because I know people mean well, but sometimes it's like, this isn't the moment.
Right. And I am guilty of that prior to all of these things. And I'm sure that I have said insensitive things along the way. But what I have found that is very, very kind is to simply say, I can't imagine what you must be feeling right now. I just want you to know that I care. And then if the person who is hurting wants to invite you into their pain, listen. And if they don't, they'll say thank you. And now that moment, that awkwardness is over. And that's a phrase that you can repeat with somebody over and over again. How many times do we just, when we're in pain, want to know that somebody cares? Are we gonna be offended if they tell us they care 25 different times? Absolutely not. That's not an offensive thing.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. This is very beautiful. So the pain of a mother is absolutely it's difficult to, I think, to lose your child, whether they're babies or whether they're adults. Your children are not supposed to go before you. And and I know in a marriage is tough as it is. You know, there can be elements that we have to work through, but when you throw something such as this type of trial, this kind of storm that feels so probably unbearing, that has to be hard on a marriage. Can you share a little bit about how that was for you?
Yes. And very honestly, that it was brutal. And our marriage did not survive. And ironically, I was married to a pastor. And what ended up happening, as happens in every divorce, people take sides. But when a church takes a side, right, they're going to take their pastor's side and not the pastor's wife's side. And so not only did all of this cause the breakdown of my marriage, but the breakdown of my marriage caused me to lose my church and my friends, and eventually my faith for a good 10 more years. And so our divorce was in about 2000, shortly after my daughter's transplant, which was in 1997. And the divorce was finalized, and then my divorce from the church began. And it became too painful for me to go to church. My friends no longer reached out to me. I was no longer welcome in our small group. And I didn't mean to leave God. It was just one of those, I didn't have friends. And so it was like I moved away with the intent to keep in touch, but then I didn't do it. And so I grew farther and farther away from my faith and from God. And it wasn't until 10 years later, March 6th, 2010, when I heard the words high-grade invasive breast cancer, that I decided I better figure out what was going on with my faith again. And that was another altar moment. And that did not happen instantly either. There was about 4 or 5 months where I was not all that willing to just come right back to God. And through so many different avenues, I was drawn back and started going back to that very first church from 2000 and before. My friends were still there, but my children's dad was no longer a pastor there. And so the door seemed to be a lot more open. And I remember the first day I walked in, I was just like, oh, I hope I don't see anybody. I hope I don't see anybody that I know. And of course I did. And I saw my friend Karen, and I walked in and I was like, hi, Karen. And I thought she was going to, kind of look down and walk the other way. And instead, she just came right over, gave me a giant hug, and said, it's great to see you. And it was a greeting that I just felt like God was saying to me, finally, it's nice to have you back.
Yeah. Beautiful display of grace and love from your friend, and to welcome you back in, because all those years of not being, I'm sure you had to had these thoughts go through your head, and how brave and courageous it was for you to choose to go back to that church again. I mean, there's other churches you could have chosen. So what was it that drew you back in?
That one was home. And I needed to be there at that time. And it was just the right decision. It was God. That's the short answer. It was God. That was where I was supposed to be.
And I think you just demonstrated how important having a community is, right?
Absolutely.
To build that family, because you built that family from a long time ago, and the foundation, and yes, there were storms and trials and things that, but even when you left, they still, I'm sure, thought about you, prayed for you.
Absolutely. I know they did. We've since been in touch and shared stories and shared some other tragedies that they've gone through. And it is nice to be able to celebrate the good things and the not so good things also.
Yeah. So do you think that, as you're going through these trials and storms in life, and we can sometimes experience depression, anger, and all sorts of emotions that come along with it. And when we respond to run away, so to speak, or leave, do you find that sometimes the things that we think in our mind, what people think of us, is something that was just in our mind and not necessarily true? I mean, how do you think, I guess, I guess what I'm trying to ask is what do you think happens, I guess, when we kind of get to that, where we're like, well, they probably don't like me, this happened. I mean, there's all sorts of things that you can play out in your head, right? And you think, that's why I don't have friends, they're not reaching out. So how do you, I guess, even overcome that?
Oh, that's such a good question. And that's something that has been on my mind a lot recently. And not because I don't have friends, but because I still have demons from hundreds of years ago in my life that haunt me, that tell me I'm inadequate, tell me I'm not worthy. They tell me I'm irresponsible. They tell me all these terrible things about myself. And I've believed them. And I bought that lie. And they're not true. They are lies. And they are only true when I give them power in my life to be true. And I think it's the same thing when we put our own insecurities on other people and we think, oh my gosh, she thinks I'm irresponsible. She thinks I'm whatever. We're putting our fears onto someone else without even knowing if that's what they really think. And in my case, all of those demons that come up for me, I'm putting those things on God. And I think that's how he sees me. And it's just not true. Look what he gave me this morning. And it's just not true. I think that the only thing we can do is in a relationship, whether it's a relationship with God or it's a relationship with others, is we have to communicate and be honest and not put our fears on others. We need to live in the truth.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. That is so deep and so insightful. And I'm really glad you shared that, because I know there's so many people who have a hard time with that. Our minds can definitely play up a story that isn't necessarily true, but in our minds we can decide that that's the truth. And I love that you said you just have to cling on to what is true.
Mm-hmm. And communicate.
And communicate it. Wonderful. So it is amazing to see you today. Like you said, this losing your son was 31 years ago, and there's not a day that goes by that you don't think about him. I mean, how, you know, as a mother, you think about your children
Constantly.
yeah, it's pretty much every day. It's never ending. Doesn't end just because they turn 18, and doesn't end when they get married and any of that. And so how over time, you know, the grief, like you said, is different. So I love that you said it that way too. It's not that the grief ends, but the grief becomes different.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So there are still some days when I think about Brayden and I cry. And then there are some days when I think about him and I'm so grateful that we got his diagnosis because he saved my daughter's life. He saved his sister. And thinking about him is hard because I only have a few moments where he was part of my life. But as time has gone on, I don't remember as much the pain as much as I just feel comforted knowing that I can think about him and still have him as part of my life. I didn't have to run away from that pain. I didn't have to close that door and never acknowledge him ever again. It has become a moment that, I mean, truly is comforting because he's still a part of my life. And it was really displayed to me in, I think it was 2012, could have been 2013, but he's buried in Corona Del Mar, Newport Beach. And I went back to his graveside and I had, as I always do, I go to a certain market, I buy flowers and I buy a balloon. And this happened to be Valentine's week. And so balloon and a Valentine, you know, looking balloon, and then always some sort of purple or yellow flower and or white. And I went to take the vase out of the ground, and so I had to leave the weight on the ground that was holding the balloon down. It was a helium balloon, and all of a sudden this little gust of wind came and it took the balloon about 15 feet away from me. And I ran to get it, and another gust came. And I ran to get it again, and it went on for several minutes. And by the end of that time, I was absolutely giggling. And I felt like I was playing with a 2-year-old. And it was such a gift. And I will never forget that moment because I feel like God gave me a moment to play with my son. And that's just one of the ways that the grief has changed in my life, that I could look at it that way instead of just being annoyed. And I could look at it as a blessing.
That's so beautiful. And that is such a blessing that you got to have that moment. So as you have indicated, so you are an insurance agent,
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
You decided to go into that in 2016?
Correct.
And what made you decide to pick that as the avenue to have a career?
Desperation, because no one else would have me. And that is the full-on truth. I was in pharmaceutical sales for about 16 years. And when the Obamacare bill hit the pharmaceutical sales industry, the response in pharma was to lay off senior sales teams. And I was a senior specialty sales rep, which meant that my salary was higher than an introductory level agent or rep. And so these pharmaceutical companies would fire all their senior sales teams and then go dormant for about 3 months. And then they would rehire younger sales teams for far less money. And that happened to me 5 different times in less than 2 years. And each time that I would get laid off, I would take another job for slightly less money. And I would take the first thing that would come my way because I had racked up a lot of medical debt from my breast cancer days. And I had 2 kids in college. And so as that went on 5 times in less than 2 years, I went to turn in my resume for another interview with a recruiter. And they called me back and said, "You're not hireable." And I was like, what? I don't understand. How can I not be hireable? I have 2 president's clubs in my background, and I've never been out of the top third of a sales force. How can I be unhireable in my industry? And they said, "You've had 5 jobs in less than 2 years. No hiring manager is going to look at your resume. We won't send it." And that was devastating. And I did not know what to do. And it was when I was talking to Monica, a woman who works for a healthcare solutions team, a very, very successful agent. And I was asking her about my COBRA or changing to an individual plan, that during that conversation, I said to her, "Could I do what you do?" And she said, "Sure." And so the rest is history. I got my license within a couple of weeks, very, very quickly. And I made partner with Healthcare Solutions team within 2 years. And that came with a nice bonus and equity partnership going forward. And now I am licensed in 23 states and serve thousands of clients and write for over 600 carriers. So I like to call myself a broker, and I like you to come with your problem, your challenge, and let me find the solution.
That's excellent. So you are very resilient, and I mean, you just see, it seems like things just keep knocking you down, and you
Not anymore. I'm done with that.
there you go. And yet you come back fighting and you live in victory. I mean, cancer. I mean, how long did you have to go through that treatments and not feeling good and then still having to work?
You know, I was actually really lucky. I started with a lumpectomy. They actually didn't get clean margins, so I ended up doing a double mastectomy and then reconstruction. And then I didn't end up needing chemo. I didn't end up needing radiation. And I only took tamoxifen. And I took it for 6 years. It has a few side effects, and I didn't feel wonderful when I was taking that. But at the time, it was believed that it reduced the recurrence rate. And I am, May 18th, I will be 13 years cancer-free. So I would say thank you, tamoxifen, and thank you to my surgeons, and I feel good.
Awesome. So awesome. So where do you get this fighting spirit from?
I think I learned it in the pool. When I was 10, I started swimming competitively, and I was not a good swimmer. And they put a little asterisk next to my name in the tryouts, and the asterisk was only for my parents to see, but they, of course, told me later that I had an asterisk next to my name. And the asterisk meant she's terrible, and she's probably not going to last a week in the pool. And my parents bought me a team suit and a cap and goggles. And when they bought that, they made a deal with me. I had to swim for a year, so there was no quitting. And that was not the message I wanted to hear when I finished my very first big meet. They had these ribbons that were the size of my head, bigger than my head actually, And the end of that weekend, we were in the back of my mom's station wagon, as this was the 1970s. And every kid, there were 6 kids in that car. Every kid had a ribbon except for me. And of course I cried, and I didn't like swimming. I wanted to quit. And my parents wouldn't let me. So I remember decision. That's the key, right? I remember deciding, well, if I can't quit, then I better figure out how to win. And so I did. I can't say that my work ethic developed immediately, but over time, I became a very disciplined, hard worker in the pool. And I went on to go to high school state, and then I swam in college, and I set Big Ten records and won nationals, and ended up later being inducted into the Hall of Fame at Iowa. And I do attribute a lot of the tenacity and a lot of my ability to persevere to my days of training. When your coach says, go do 10 200s on the whatever interval, nobody can do that. You can't do 10 200s. You just can't in your head. And this is only part of a workout in part of a day. And, I just remember learning to take them one at a time. And I just need to finish this one. I need to get, I need to touch the wall before the 2 minutes and 30 seconds, and then push off again and do the next one. And it was a lesson that has served me very, very well, especially when my daughter was sick and the days were long and scary and painful. And there were days that she was sick where I knew I couldn't do 10 200s. And I would just focus on the one thing that was in front of me at that moment. And there is a verse about that, right? Do not be anxious about anything. And it goes on to say, let the day's own troubles be sufficient for the day. And that is forefront in my mind. I try to live for this moment and not try to live my entire future right now, because you can't do it.
Yeah, that's just wonderful that your parents pushed you, basically encouraged you, and didn't let you quit. And from that, you rose up, so to speak, and took the challenge, and it has really benefited you through your life. And what a gift that you had. And what a gift that you are a wonderful mom. And your kids are very blessed, I'm sure. I mean, you just are phenomenal. So I am just so excited that you took the time out of your busy day to come and hang out with us on American Dream Makers. I really appreciate it so much. You wrote a book, and it's called Altered.
It's called Altered. And the subtitle is Finding Hope Through Grit and Gratitude to Never Give Up. This is my daughter on the cover. She's on the Silver Strand Beach on Coronado Island in San Diego. And the book is really just a memoir, and it goes through my story. And at the end of each section, I tried to put some questions that were relevant to what I was feeling and growing through, if you will, during those times. So I put those questions at the end of the sections. My favorite part about the book, I can't take credit for, really. All I did was pull together a list of songs that inspired me and that were appropriate for each of those sections. So at the end of each section of my book is a playlist. And then I took all of the playlists, there's about 4 or 5, and I put them on a Spotify list. And so that's about 4.5 hours of inspiring music. And I love to just have it on low in my background, and it encourages me to get through that next moment or whatever it is that is challenging me in my day. It encourages me to have the right perspective. So I would love if anybody would email me at kimberly@kimsurance.com. I would love to share that playlist with you. It's, as I said, it's on Spotify. It's completely free. And it's just a way that you can bring this message into your day for, a little bit of time.
Excellent. I am definitely going to be emailing you for that playlist, because having some inspirational music all day long can absolutely change your day, your thoughts, your attitude. And so music is a real blessing that God has given us. And so, I'll definitely be emailing you. So you guys absolutely email Kimberly at kimsurance.com, and she will get that Spotify playlist to you. Kimberly, as you were talking about all these things, and I just see who you are today, that you are a strong, courageous, brave woman, and you're out there not keeping all that you learned to yourself, that you're sharing the wisdom that God has given you. And it reminds me of the verse, James 1. James 1, verse 2, count it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you meet various trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. And I believe some of the other versions will say that, that you basically are perfect, so that you are perfected, so that, and it's part of, I guess, the sanctification. But when you're in the trial, it's hard to say, thank you, Lord, for this trial. I know Job said it.
It is very hard. And for me, it's always come in retrospect. And finding little things along the way to be grateful for, because there's always something, no matter how bad it is, no matter how sick my daughter was. She wasn't dead. I could be grateful for that. And no matter how bad it is, there's always something. And it's where our eyes look, right? If we want to look at the bad stuff, we're not going to be able to get through those trials. But if we want to look at the things that we're grateful for, we can make it to the next moment. And in that next moment, there will be another thing that we can find to be grateful for. And I have really begun just praying for eyes to see the blessings that come my way. And imagine if I had never looked for yellow roses, how many blessings I would have missed out on. And I really think we all have yellow roses of some sort in our lives. And I would just encourage you, everyone, don't give up and look for those rose moments in your life.
Thank you so much for that. Such encouraging words, Kimberly. And I do believe that you are complete and lacking nothing. You are perfected because of the things that have occurred. And thank you so much again for coming on and sharing your beautiful heart and being so vulnerable. That's not easy sometimes, to share all of those details and putting it out there for the world to see, hear, and experience. But what a gift you are giving to all of us to be able to share this testimony, this God story that he has placed in your life. And he's not done yet. I mean, you have a lot of life to live. And so it's going to be exciting to see what else is around the corner for you. So my friend, I am so glad that to know you, and I'm excited. I hope to get to know you even better as time goes on, but I'm really excited that we are sisters in Christ. And so we will get to be together for eternity. So we've got a lot of time together.
Amen.
And that's a blessing. So thank you again for joining us today, Kim. I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye to you for now.
Thank you.
Oh, you are absolutely, it was my pleasure and my honor. So I will See you in just a bit here. Guys, thank you so much for tuning in today. What an amazing woman. What an amazing story. You guys get this shared out. If you are not a part of the American Dreammakers group, please join our group. It is a group to inspire, impact, and help transform one another. And I'd love for it to be interactive. I'm on Facebook or on YouTube. I'm also on LinkedIn. So please, share this away. What a wonderful message Kimberly has given us. And join us on American Dreammakers tomorrow. I've got another guest coming in, and it's going to be exciting as well. So I will see you. Have a wonderful, blessed day, and I'll say goodbye for now.